How are you all doing? Had good breakfast? Good coffee? Mysuru is famous for coffee, you know that, right? I believe Dr. Venkataraja was telling me that there are a lot of people from outside Mysuru, outside India also here. So welcome to all of you. So dear Dr. Prasad, Director, SDMIMD, Dr. Venkataraja, Conference Chairperson, delegates to the conference from both overseas and within India, esteemed faculty of the Institute, students, and my dear friends. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, addressing such a distinguished group of future leaders and innovators. The topic, the economic growth and sustainable development emerging trends, is of great significance at this current juncture. You have already heard what Dr. Venkataraja and Dr. Prasad had to say. There is no doubt that economic growth is essential for us, for the entire world, not only for India, but for the entire world. But how do we grow this economy, global economy, without destroying the globe? I think that is a challenge that we are all faced with. And we will try to see how we can do that, what are the tools and techniques already available with us, what kind of mindset we should have when we approach these challenges. So when we talk about economics, economic growth, it's not just about numbers, right? It's about practical, impactful outcomes, and how these can be designed for our purpose is what we have to see. So when we talk about economic growth, especially economic growth in India, nowadays you hear only the good things, right? So India is the fastest growing large economy in the world, right? So India is the 5th largest economy. When we say 5th largest economy, which are the economies bigger than India? I have a lot of young friends here. Anybody wants to say? Which is the largest? US. Second? Right. Third? Fourth? Yeah. So third is Japan, fourth is Germany, and fifth is India. Right. So we are expecting right now we are fifth. I think in 2025 we will probably become the fourth. We will overtake Germany. And 2027 we expect to overtake Japan, and then we will be the third largest. So, and the growth rates are pretty impressive, right? We are talking about 6.5% to 7% for this current financial year. And the last 3 years, we have seen 9.1, 7.2 and 8.2%. And as Dr. Venkataraja and Dr. Prasad were mentioning, we are looking at 2047, right? As a kind of, because it's the 100th year of our independence. And we are all talking about, Amrit Kal and things like that. And we are aspiring to be a $30 trillion economy by 2047. And if you have seen or heard or read about Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, right? He is the Executive Director of International Monetary Fund, and he was the Chief Economic Advisor for the Government of India, right? So he is talking about, you know the number? What is the number he's talking about? We are at 3.9. We are talking about 30 trillion for 2047. Dr. Subramanian is talking about 55 trillion, right? It sounds really aspirational, ambitious, right? Or maybe a little bit unrealistic. But these are the different expectations that is there for the Indian economy. So do we say that it's all hunky-dory? All things bright and beautiful? We are in a nice runway, we are taken off to be the next economic superpower, clear blue skies, we'll have a beautiful landing in 2047. Unfortunately, that's not quite the case, right? And with apologies to our good Professor Dr. Venkataraja, economics, as you know, is also called, what is it called? As a dismal science, right? So because many times we had to look at what are the downsides, you had to be realistic, you had to be pragmatic, and it's not just about rosy projections, right? So some of the things that are challenging in terms of economic growth, not only for India but also for the global economy. So if you look at, for example, the latest October 2024 IMF global forecast, they're talking about 3.3% for 2023 and 3.2 and 3.1 as we go along for 2024 and 2025. And as you know, we have seen several geopolitical crises, right? 2 wars are going on in the world, and just 3-4 years back we have a pandemic. And the latest, what we have seen is the US elections, right? And I can tell you, since I am basically a market man, right? I've been in markets for the last 33 years. So there is a tremendous amount of turmoil and anxiety in financial markets, global financial markets, because people are anxious about what is it that Mr. Trump will do after taking charge. And you can see the impact in currency markets, commodities, bond markets, equities, everywhere. So these are the kind of things, depending on what moves, what measures that the new administration takes, that will have very important impact on the economic growth to come. So it is never linear. It is never linear. I think some of us would have seen, let's say about 20 years back, all the craze about BRICS, right? The BRICS economies, right? This was, Goldman Sachs came out with this report, I think in 2003, right? And at that time, then the economy took off. We were growing at 8.5% continuously for about 5 years. And at that time, people thought, this is it. This is the new normal, and we'll keep growing at 8% forever. It doesn't happen like that, right? And these are the things, especially when we talk about sustainability. What interrupted that growth was the global financial crisis, but that is a man-made crisis, right? In a way, even climate change or climate distress or sustainability issues that come with the globe are also man-made. But it may be more long-term in nature. For example, what happened in pandemic was entirely man-made, right? But it is something, it is not a trigger like a global financial crisis. It is not an immediate financial market crash, but it is something that built up in the background over a number of years. So these kind of uncertainties will be there when we talk about economic growth and prosperity for all of us, for the entire globe. Now, maybe, we should just look at, when we talk about economic growth, why do we need growth? I mean, when I come to the very basic fundamental issue, right? As Dr. Prasad was saying, growth is absolutely essential, but why? Let's look at this now, right? So, as we are talking about, the largest economies in the world, right? It looks good in terms of, this is the one. It looks good in terms of the size of the economy, right? 3.89 trillion, 7% growth, great. But just if you look at the next column here, on per capita, we are just $2,700 per capita, right? So on the total GDP size, we are number 5. On per capita, we will be around 135, right? And you look at the top, the richest, this is 86,600. I mean, it's even difficult to imagine that kind of per capita income, and this is where we are. And just look at the globe. Look at the globe here, and this blue and gray, this is where 50,000 and above per capita is there, right? And as you can see, vast portion of the world, right, is in this area, right? So, I mean, if you talk about the richest, if you talk about this $60,000, $50,000, so they are called, the golden billion, right? Out of the total population of, let's say, 8 billion on this planet, about 1 billion is here, the richest, right? It's about 330 million in USA. Western Europe will be about 475 million, and few here in Australia, few in Canada, and so on. So this is not sustainable. This is not the way that we can have a long-term well-being, prosperity and balance in the world if you have this kind of disconnect, right? So there is no doubt that economic growth is absolutely essential. So if that is so essential, what is the challenge for us? So we can just go out and grow the economy at any cost, at any pace. It doesn't work like that, right? So what are the challenges? Because all kinds of economic growth depend on some of these factors, right? Of course, you have to generate power. I can tell you, so for example, right, let's just look at the sources of energy, right? And we talk about the kind of oil consumption that takes place, right? So if you see US, yeah, right? US, what is the per capita consumption of oil or oil equivalent in a year, right? If you just compare that and compare US to, let's say, Western Europe or India, right? So I'll give you, for example, in US, it's around 26 barrels per capita. That is the consumption in that country. Now, Western Europe, what do you think it will be? If US is at 26, will it be something similar? Less? Any guesses? We are talking about oil consumption, right? Because economic growth depends on energy, and energy ultimately has to come from fossil fuels to a large extent. Of course, there is a transition happening, but right now it is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So if US is at 26, where will Europe be? Yeah, that's lesser, and that's a good guess. That's around 12, right? So that's around 12 for Europe. And where is India? India is less than 1. Less than 1. So if you need that prosperity to come through to the rest of the world for economic growth, you need more of all of this: generating power, manufacturing, right? Now we are talking about having a larger share of manufacturing in our GDP. Right now, manufacturing has been stuck at around 14% of GDP for so many years, and we are trying to increase that. It's still not happening. But manufacturing will depend a lot upon power, right? Cutting down forests. Now, there is a problem with what kind of green cover we have, and in terms of, ideally for a country like India in the subtropical region, the experts say we should have a forest cover of around 30%, 32%, 33% in that range. So where we are around 19 to 20%, right? So there's and if you have manufacturing, if you have growth, if you have more cities, obviously what will suffer is forests. Similarly about transportation, producing food. Food, is it an important aspect in economic growth and sustainability? It is, right? So why is that so? Why is that so? How is food important? Everybody needs food. That's absolutely the basic, right? For humanity. So what is it that impacts sustainability when you talk about food?
Inorganic farming.
Correct. Inorganic farming, and also, sir, you said something. Carbon cycle is one, and it's also just the kind of food you have, right? So as you go along, as the incomes improve, people want more protein-rich food, right? So protein-rich food comes from where? From meat, from fish, from dairy, right? All these require more resources, right? So for example, once upon a time it was kind of a scandal, right? So US wanted cheap hamburgers, right? So hamburgers are made of what? Pork and beef, right? So where do they get cheap beef? At that time they were talking about Brazil and Argentina, right? So how does Brazil or Argentina export cheap beef?
Dairy farm.
They have, these are very large countries with smaller population. They have grasslands, and in Brazil, the space is there, population is smaller. So they were kind of cutting down the Amazonian rainforest, creating grasslands, having cattle herds there, exporting beef, so the Americans could have cheap hamburgers, right? So this kind of consumption, right, can be tremendously destructive for the environment, affects sustainability, your forest cover, right, and the extent of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere, right? So food is also a very big part of sustainability, right? And buildings such as these, right? Of course, now there are different standards in green buildings, and some of the more aware corporates are building more green friendly or environment friendly buildings, and also repurposing the older buildings to some extent, right? So there is absolutely no doubt economic growth leads to all these kinds of requirements, and that in turn leads to global warming. So what is global warming? There is an increase in actual temperature, 1.2 degrees centigrade, right? And that is something that we have seen for decades now, right? What are the effects of climate change? So hotter temperatures, more severe storms. Now, I mean, you see just this year, the kind of excess rains we have had, the flooding we have seen, and it is not just in India. You would have seen even in Europe, in US, in China, you would have seen in the visuals, the flooding in the cities, the kind of damage caused by cyclones. They have a different word for cyclones. What is that? Twister, right? Hurricanes, right? And for some reason, all the hurricanes in US are named after girls' names. I don't know why that is, right? So that is there. So these are wreaking havoc across the countries there, right? So severe storms, increased droughts. I mean, just this year, I think our monsoon has been slightly above the long period average, right? It's about 106%. But it is not just about the quantity of rain. It also depends on the dispersion and the temporal distribution. The rains have to come at the right time in the right place. That is what is optimum for our agriculture output. Health risks, we already mentioned the COVID pandemic, poverty and displacements, right? So this, especially displacement, I think it's very unfortunate, very distressing. So if you look at, let's say, the islands of the South Pacific, or countries like Bangladesh or Maldives, for example, a rise in the ocean level by just a few meters can completely wipe out thousands of square kilometers of the country. So these are the kinds of challenges that are there. How do we tackle these challenges, right? So sustainable, it's not that we don't know what to do. We know there is a problem, but there are people who are, you can say, climate deniers, right? For example, again, I have to talk about President Trump because he could have a big impact on all this. So you know what he says, right, about energy, right? He just says, drill, baby, drill, right? He's going to open up more areas for oil exploration, for oil drilling, for fracking, right? So, I mean, you have these kind of attitudes, and he is, say, climate denier. But by and large, most of the people do acknowledge that it is the human impact on global ecology, global climate has been quite severe. And it's also that we know what the solutions are, right? We know what the problem is, we know what the solutions are. What is it that we are supposed to do? We have sustainable development goals. See, I am told by Professor that, there is a paper which covers sustainable development. So I am sure the MBA students will be studying all this as part of their curriculum. So sustainable development goals are something, about 17 goals. These were formulated by the United Nations. So those are the goals that we all have to work towards, right? There is a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement of 2015, which the USA walked out of, right? And the actions. So broadly, what is it that we have to do? It's about cutting emissions, adapting to climate impacts, and the financing required for that. So if I talk about cutting emissions, right, some of the things that have taken place, right, for example, if you look at Denmark is a very good case study, right. So the nation invested heavily in wind power, right. So that resulted in a 70% reduction in carbon emissions since 1990, while maintaining consistent economic growth, right? So this shows how targeted investments can fuel an economy while protecting the environment. That is one example when we are talking about cutting emissions. The other is what is happening with solar power, particularly in China, right? So according to the International Energy Agency, global renewable energy capacity expanded by more than 10% in 2023. And China, it's considered the factory of the world. It contributed 50% of this increase in solar and wind energy, right? So this not only reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but creates economic opportunities. For instance, the renewable energy now supports over 12 million jobs worldwide. Then when we talk about cutting emissions, there's another concept that we are talking about, which is the circular economy, right? So earlier, probably it's maybe more of a Western approach, right? It used to be what we call the traditional linear economy, which is take, make and dispose, use and throw, right? So in contrast to that, right, a circular economy emphasizes reducing waste by recycling, repurposing and reusing resources, right? So the researchers at Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimate that this kind of approach can add $4.5 trillion to global economic output by 2030. Now these are not very alien to Indians, at least. See, if you remember, of course now maybe we are unfortunately copying more of Western habits. But if you think back a few years, I think there was a concept of treating all resources as very valuable. And you will see, whether it's books or clothes getting handed over by the elder siblings to the younger siblings or among neighbors or among the relatives. So you don't throw things away, right? So you try to extract the maximum out of whatever resources that you have. So that is one thing. And for example, I can give other examples like IKEA, right? IKEA, we all know. Anybody has gone to IKEA Bangalore? Yeah, good. IKEA Hyderabad? Oh, I see people from Hyderabad also. When IKEA Hyderabad opened, that was such a tremendous excitement. There was traffic jams all around the city, right? And the huge, enormous showrooms. And I'm a fan of IKEA products, no doubt about that, right? So IKEA has committed to becoming fully circular by 2030. That is, they're going to be designing products that are easier to recycle and repurpose, right? Similarly, there is another company called Patagonia. Anybody heard of Patagonia? Yeah, so it's about garments, right? Sports garments, right? Yeah. So Patagonia's business model includes encouraging customers to repair their clothing rather than replace it, which aligns economic incentives with sustainability. Our grandmothers used to do the same, right? Now it's branded and it's become very famous. So that's Patagonia. So, like what Paul Hawkins says, the future belongs to those who understand that doing more with less is compassionate, prosperous, and enduring. So what I want to say is, we should not go away with the impression that it is either economic development or ecology. You don't have to make a hard choice between economic growth and no economic growth and protecting environment, right? There are commercial opportunities, economic benefits in moving from one way of doing business to another way of doing business. That is something I think we should like to keep in mind. Right. So solutions, some of these things that we have talked about as an example. So these are, switching energy systems. So we have a number of countries which are committing to net zero, right, by 2050. Some of this looks honestly very ambitious to me, right? If you need to cut by 30% consumption of fossil fuels by 2030, I don't think it's going to happen. It's only about 6 years away, right? So we have to see how that pans out. So that is about switching the energy system. Second is adapting to climate consequences. This is where that we mentioned about where the risks are. Again, early warning systems, right? This can deliver benefits up to 10 times the initial cost. There is a commercial opportunity there. And climate action needs significant financial investments. So where are these investments going to come up? We saw the global GDP and per capita map, right? So if you need to move from one kind of energy source to another kind of energy source, that needs funding. It's not going to come free. So, I mean, for countries even like India, right, fifth largest economy and all that, but you know, where are you going to raise the funding? So that is where in COP, that is Compact of Parties, so COP 26, now COP 29 is going on. It's underway in Azerbaijan right now. Right, it's I think the COP 26 is going to end on 22nd. Right, so the developing countries had requested for funding for this transition, right, to make it sustainable development, and they had talked about maybe about $100 billion per annum of funding from the developed countries. So actually that was supposed to start, I think, 2015. We have not seen much of that money, hardly anything. I think only last 1 or 2 years, little bit of lobbying has improved the flow a little bit. So that's not going to be very easy. So, so in terms of investing and financial instruments, that naturally leads me to my area of experience and expertise, which is financial markets. So if you are trying to fund these kind of transitions, what is one thing is, okay, developed country, the rich countries can assist in the transition to the developing countries, but there are other ways to do it, and one of those is the financial markets itself, global capital markets, financial markets, which assist in this kind of transition. Right? How do they do that? How do they do that? So which are the instruments or financial instruments that go into it? So I'm sure many of you have come across, read about this. You have green equities, right? Sorry?
Green bonds.
Green bonds, yes. Green equities are there, green companies, green funds, green debt, green bonds, green loans, right? So but what does it mean? What does green loans mean or green bonds mean? Sorry? Yeah, but what does it really mean? So in terms of, see, one good thing is these debates, see, at a government level, maybe developed countries are not coming out and putting the money on the table, but there is sufficient awareness and consciousness across the corporate world in the world, right? And that is having a bearing on financial markets also. See, for example, green funds. So if you talk about green funds, there is sufficient consciousness that it is better to invest in companies which are more aware of the environment, which are into sustainable practices, which have growth, which are not damaging to the environment. And what happens is these kind of avenues, these kind of companies will get better funding. What do I mean by better? Slightly cheaper funding, right? Especially on the debt side, right? So what are the trends here? Emerging trends in sustainable finance. So you can see these are pretty amazing numbers. Look at this, $53 trillion, right? So we talked about India GDP at 3.9 trillion and so on. This is the AUM. ESG AUM is expected to be 53 trillion by 2025. And then look at this. This is 11 trillion is the ESG bond market. For context, what is the largest bond market in the world? What is the biggest bond market in the world? US. For everything, US has to be the biggest, right? So they have a $33 trillion bond market, and you can see in comparison, 11 trillion is a very impressive number. And then the ETFs are about 1 trillion, right? and we are talking about green bonds, sustainable bonds, right? So in 2023, 2024 is not yet complete. 2023, $1.2 trillion, and the overall outstanding amount is about 3.1 trillion, right? So these are very large numbers. These are very encouraging. These trends are encouraging in the sense there is sufficient awareness among issuers, among investors, so that the sustainable finance is gaining traction and really building up very strong momentum. Look at this, for example. 95% of S&P 500 have made detailed ESG disclosures, right? So 5,348 companies have committed to UN-backed SBT, as they call it, Science-Based Target Initiative, SBTI. So these are the good features for sustainable development, right? So what is it that, where do we stand as a country, as an economy, right? So this, you recall that Prime Minister made this commitment, right? Net zero emissions by 2070, right? Non-fossil fuel 500 gigawatts by 2030, 50% energy. I mean, you would have read all this, right? These are very ambitious targets. In some of this, we are ahead of schedule, in the sense that what we were expected to have by 2024, we are well ahead of that in renewable energy. Some of these others are all work in progress, right? So financial markets specific to India, these are the trends, right? For example, sustainable debt market is about nearly $100 billion, which is not a small sum, right? Year-to-date issuance is already exceeding this, so we will end up with 19.1 billion. Social bonds, green bonds, stability-linked loans. So here utilities are the biggest, then come financials, then government, and so on. So you may be interested in seeing the government name. I don't know if this is well known or not. Look at this. Government of India is also there in green bonds, right? So 16,000 crores through sovereign green bonds, and actual amount was actually spent there. In 2024, it's 20,000 crores, and in the current year, as per the RBI schedule, they have said 25 to 30,000 crores of green bonds will be issued. So what I have seen in the market is that when the green bonds come out, so there is sufficient amount of interest. Let's say if it is a 10-year benchmark security is going at around 7%, right, at that time. So the green bonds went at around 6.9. So about 10 to 12 basis points, the yield on the green bond was lesser. So that is how the incentivization works, right? The global markets, financial markets are willing to fund you at a slightly lower cost if you are going to use the proceeds of that funding for projects that will have a positive environmental impact. For example, this Rampur hydro project in India and similar projects around the world, right? So that's how it works in terms of financial markets and sustainable funding. Specifically, I wanted to go through a little bit on the sustainability linked loan, because some of you, as you graduate or you move into corporate life, these are things maybe you can keep in mind, because your company will be borrowing. Now, earlier, just a few years back, just 3-4 years back, looking at sustainable funding was a little difficult, because at that time they were asking for long-term goals, 5 years, 10 years. So we wanted to issue a bond, right? We issued a bond, dollar bond in global markets. That was a 5-year tenor. At that time, when we were trying to make it a green bond, the markets were saying, we need at least 7 to 10 years kind of projects. That is how we are structured. Now, things keep evolving, keep changing. Now you have even shorter term loans, right? So these are the things that you can keep in mind. So when you go into your corporate lives, right? So you can look for where you can get a green, stability linked loan. And the way the structuring, you have to look at identify key KPIs, key performance indicators, and SPT is sustainable performance targets, right? So the way it works is you structure this in terms of having your performance targets. So as a company, what is it that you have committed to? For example, if I talk about Wipro is committed to net zero by 2040, right? The country has committed to net zero by 2070. The company has committed to net zero by 2040. Then there are other goals, other targets that we have. So if a company has such kind of targets, and if they're raising funding, and they will demonstrate that these funding will be used to meet those targets, then you will have this kind of a structuring, and that will help you in, let's say, it will have a slight pricing advantage. See, what happens is the lending bank and the borrower will engage an external agency. See, because it's not enough that the company says I have met my targets, right? You need an external third party, a neutral third party, who will make an assessment of how you are progressing. And every year there will be an assessment, and this SLL or sustainability linked loan will give you a benefit of 5 to 10 basis points, right? So, and the assessment is done, and in case that the targets are not met, there is even a penalty, right? So instead of getting 5 basis cheaper, you may end up paying a penalty. So what I mean to say, these are real world structures. Practically this is happening. There is an incentive for companies to go into sustainable practices, and you will get a financial benefit out of that. Some of the global companies which have taken sustainable loans. So you can see some of these KPIs, net zero carbon, or the proportion of women in management, right? That is for SAP. So this is another company here. They had a commitment of 85% reduction in emissions per employee for scope 1 to 3 by 2040. ATOS, 50% reduction in scope 1 to 3. Right? These are the different kinds of parameters that companies commit to. Dr. Indra, how much time do I have, sir? Another 5 minutes. Okay. So when I talk about, obviously I will know my company best in terms of these practices. So as probably most of you know that 67% of the economic value of Wipro has been transferred to an endowment firm. This is the Azim Premji Foundation, right? So, and the Azim Premji Foundation is a not-for-profit, and it is completely committed to a number of social initiatives. The top priority is education, and education, it's the APF is working on the tens of thousands of government schools across the country. And what is the goal there? The goal there is to improve educational outcomes by training the teachers, right? So government schools, obviously, good people are there, but they need better tools and techniques to deliver better outcomes, right? Then, of course, you might have heard of the Azim Premji University, which is there in Bangalore, and one more university is coming up in Bhopal. That is one, education. Second is healthcare. Primary healthcare is the other major initiative. Recently, APF donated 500 crores to the Christian Medical College in Vellore for a new medical college. Then COVID was an instance that was, I think, many people stepped up, many companies stepped up. And in the case of Wipro also, Wipro and APF came together and committed 1,125 crores for COVID relief. Right, one of the IT campuses in Pune was converted into a COVID hospital, right, for 450 beds, right, and Wipro through its company canteens served 2.97 million meals to migrant workers, right. These are the kind of things that Wipro has been able to do. Now, due to the limited time that we have, I'll just briefly say these are the commitments, these are the goals for Wipro. Why I am mentioning Wipro is that if you look at different companies, they will have similar goals or different goals, but I think large number of companies in India are quite aware now, and these are the kind of things you have to look for, right? Renewable energy, what is the commitment? Reduction in scope 1 and scope 2, recycling of wastewater, right? These are the things that are there. What is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? I will not go into the details. Biodiversity in our India campuses, this is one of the things that we have, right? And scope 3 emissions, you can see how we are bringing down the emissions here, right? Water used, this is total water consumption, and waste recycle is going up, and this is women employees 36.6%, persons with disabilities, right? So these are the kind of areas that where we are trying to make an impact, and just look at what is happening in terms of, if you look at it as a cost to the environment, that cost has been steadily coming down. And these are other parameters, because it is not just about forests or lakes or other things. When you talk about sustainability, it's also the impact that you have on the rest of the population, on the rest of the people, right? So people profits planet, as they say, right? About sourcing. So these are the areas, for example, the SDGs. We have 17 SDGs. The way that we are structured, we are contributing to these kinds: good health and well-being, education, clean energy, right, and so on. Out of the 17, these are the total this one. So depending on the company's priorities, they can pick different SDGs that they can go for. And in terms of distinctions, this is one thing that we are proud of. We are one of the member of the Dow Jones Sustainable Index for about 14th consecutive year, right? And it's not just all large projects. There are smaller issues that we try to take care of. This is something called Mitti Cafe. I don't know if people are familiar with that. So this Mitti Cafe has opened in our Kodati facility in Sarjapur. So what is Mitti Cafe? Mitti Cafe employs persons with disabilities, right? So physical and mental, and these are the things, the small things, large things that we try to do, right? So particularly for my young friends, so when you talk about economic growth and development, don't get guilt tripped, because you know what, this is one of the things I observed when aircraft travel really took off in India and some of the other developing countries. Then you saw a lot of articles in the Western press that this is going to increase pollution, ozone layer, and things like that. So some of these things come up when the developing countries start consuming more. So don't worry about that. These are the things that are, all of us have the right to economic development, to improve our well-being, to have better prosperity, right? So if I just look at this, okay? CO2 emissions, right? Qatar is a champion, right? 30.27 tons per annum per capita. Kuwait, Bahrain, Dubai, UAE, Australia. Where is India? This is a list of 195 countries. I am still searching for India. Finally, right? So we may be 5th in GDP size. We are 130 in per capita GDP. We are 1.61, we are number 99 in per capita emissions, right? So guys, chill out. Don't get hassled by people who say that you are consuming too much, you are emitting too much as a country, right? We also have a right to develop. So this is one of the things that we used to say, that the developed world, which has already pumped in so much of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, they have to create space for the developing world to be able to develop and grow, right? This is another example how per capita, the way it's going. You can see China is really zooming up there. We are still quite low, right? So what we can do as, we know what the problem is, right? We know what the solutions are. What we can do as individuals, for example. So my daughter had a small quarrel with my wife. She was saying, "Mom, you're using ChatGPT for everything." Don't do that, because that consumes 5 to 10% more power than using Google. Right? So at an individual level, see, how much AC do I need to use? Do I need to use an AC at all? Can I use public transport rather than taking out my car or my motorcycle? Right? At an individual level, can we make certain choices, certain adjustments that will help in the larger cause? And that is as an individual. As a corporate, of course, I have given you several examples. So you can, if you are looking at prospective employers, maybe this is one filter you want to apply for yourself. You want to work in a better company, more aware company. And as an entrepreneur, enormous opportunities. Enormous opportunities. Because all this, what we have talked about, trillions or billions of dollars of business opportunities. Keep your eyes out, keep your eyes and ears open, right? Please try to spot that. And this is the next gen of this country, the guys who are the youth now, and you hear about unicorns and entrepreneurship. This is a great area. I think this is something that all of us, all the young students have to keep in mind. And lastly, Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General. All of us have to do it. There is no choice. There is no plan A, plan B, because there is no planet B, right? This is the only planet we have, right? Spaceship Earth, as they call it. So let's all take care of that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful and insightful talk. With the kind permission of our chief guest, we would like to request your participation in an interactive Q&A session with the attendees. Participants